Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
Welcome to our 8th program in our series titled Journey Through Time. On today's program, we're going to have a conversation with a person from history. That's what this whole series is about. We call it Chautauqua format, and very well-educated people play people in history. And we welcome to our program today Abigail Adams, who lived from 1744 until 1818. She was First Lady of the United States from 1797 until 1801 and was the wife of President John Adams and was the mother of President John Quincy Adams. Was the only father-son to be president until the President Bush's in our time. Welcome to our program, Miss Adams. It's a pleasure to welcome you to 2006 to travel through time.
Thank you very much.
And I'm very pleased to have our regular panelist, Erna Reinhard, who is Director of Public Relations at North Idaho College, and Erna will commence today's question with our distinguished guest, Abigail Adams.
Welcome to the program, Mrs. Adams.
Thank
It's
you
wonderful
very
to
much.
have you here. Share with our viewers a little bit about where you grew up and a little bit about your young years, and then also how you met your husband.
All right. I was born in 1744, as Mr. Stewart said, in the town of Weymouth, Massachusetts, and that was a little bit outside of Boston, Massachusetts. And at that time, Weymouth was a colony. It was part of the Massachusetts colony of England. And so it was a very exciting time to grow up. My father was Parson Smith, and he was the parson of Weymouth. So our family was quite respected in our community and also had a lot of work to do in our community, caring for our parishioners. And so I was taught by my mother and by my grandmother to work in the house and to also take care of our community. I had an older sister, Mary, and then I had two younger sisters and a younger brother, Will. Unfortunately, I was pretty sick my whole life. I was a very sickly baby, and also I wasn't allowed out of the home much. So I liked to write letters to friends, and that's how I really kind of got to be friends with a lot of people, is by writing them letters. And that was the thing I loved to do most in the world. I visited Boston early on to visit my uncle and my aunt there, and there I met a young attorney named John Adams. Now, he didn't notice me very much. He thought that I was too much of a wit and perhaps spoke my mind a little too freely. But later, his good friend Richard Cranch began courting my sister Mary. And so Mr. Adams would come along with Mr. Cranch to our home when he would visit Mary, and little by little, I think maybe I grew on him. And so we wrote to each other for a long time while he was traveling around Boston, working on his law practice. And finally, we became betrothed. He asked my father to court me. It took a while before we got married. We courted for 3 years. From the time I was 17 until I was 20. But finally, when I was 20 years old, we married.
Excellent, thank you.
And then after your marriage, you've become very famous in history. Tell us a little bit about that life. We're going to talk some about public policy and laws and all, but talk about life with John Adams and your children. And as you do that, he became very, very involved in politics and was gone a lot. So share what family life was like with Mr. Adams.
Well, in the early days, before he became so involved, understand that the time period we were living through was right at the end of what was called the French and Indian Wars, or the 7 Years' War, where England was fighting against France and some of the Indians that were in our part of the country in Massachusetts. And even though England won that conflict, it was very devastatingly expensive for them. And so in the early days, we were a loyal colony, and we enjoyed our farm. We had a farm, which is how we maintained our livelihood, above John's law practice. And so we enjoyed, living off the produce of our farm, reading the newspapers at night. But the more we read the newspapers and the more he pursued his law practice, the more we realized that the taxes that England was levying on the colonies in an attempt to make back the money from the 7 Years' War was unconstitutional. And I believe that right along with John. There was never a time when I thought that he was wrong in his feelings about that. And so he started traveling around to attempt to get support for at least a response that the colony would make to these unconstitutional taxes. Meanwhile, we had 4 children. We had a daughter, Abigail, or Nabby as we called her, a son, John Quincy, a son, Charles, and a son, Thomas, and a daughter, Susanna, who unfortunately died when she was less than 2 years old. And I don't really like to talk about that episode. But John wasn't around much, and so I ran the farm.
So you ran the farm and reared the children.
I ran the farm and reared the children, taught them how to read. I enjoyed that.
Take us into the independence, and there was the famous Second Continental Congress.
Yes, indeed.
And the Declaration of Independence, and then you would have Articles of Confederation, and finally a Constitution. And tell us the role that John Adams played in that process.
Well, my husband played a very important role in the entire process. I don't believe that history has given him his due, I would like to say. First, he served on both Continental Congresses. He was one of the people, the 3 men, that wrote the Declaration of Independence.
Although 5 were involved, you're saying only 3 did the writing?
Well, I'm saying that Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams were. Thomas Jefferson, who is our friend, later said that he merely wrote and John and Benjamin dictated.
But wasn't it Roger Sherman and Robert Livingston on the committee?
Yes, certainly they were on the committee.
But you don't want to give them any credit.
Well, I will give them credit. I just believe that I would like my husband to receive the credit that he is due as well. However, he also went abroad early on to try to negotiate with the French to help us out during that time period. And they eventually did, and he also went to Holland to try to get some money for our new country after the war was over as well. He also, while we were living in London, while he was the ambassador to the court of St. James, would send drafts of what he believed to be should be the new Constitution back to the United States.
Thank you. Reinhardt.
Share with us some of the memorable moments that you remember as being the First Lady, as your husband was the president. When your husband was president, what are some of the things that you remember that were great memories for you?
Well, first off, being First Lady was difficult for me because I always liked to speak my mind, and I felt that it was hard for me to try to stem my speech sometimes. I wanted to say what I wanted to say. Can I tell a little bit about what I had hoped, what I had told my husband early on while he was writing the laws? At the beginning, I had told him that if he did not remember the ladies, that we would foment a rebellion against them and refuse to recognize any republic in which we had no voice. And even though I believe that he did forget the ladies, and so did the other framers of our laws, I always tried to give him my opinions of things when I felt that it was warranted. As First Lady, however, I had to be very careful that other people did not perceive that he was unduly influenced by his wife. So that was a difficulty for me. But I did enjoy Martha Washington while I was the Second Lady. I enjoyed her company very much. When I was First Lady, I enjoyed writing letters on my husband's behalf. That was one of my favorite tasks. I did not enjoy making calls to people. There are a lot of social obligations as First Lady that were difficult for me from time to time. I did enjoy the challenge of our new home. We moved into the White House, what is called the White House, during my husband's presidency. And it was in the middle of a vast wilderness because the city of Washington, D.C. was only just then being built. And so we had to prepare the home for visiting dignitaries, and that was a challenge, and that was, I think I rose to the occasion.
Great.
And hearing a presentation you gave before you, certainly, as one would expect, was a great defender of your husband, who was president. You know, your president would lose the election after 4 years when he ran again in 1800 to Thomas Jefferson. And many people in history or look back on history and conclude that probably he lost it because of a law that was passed. And would you share that with our viewers, and how would you defend such a law? That really probably cost him the election.
I presume you are referring to the Sedition Act?
I am.
You are, okay. Well, I think that maybe you are correct, that law was not popular. However, my husband, shall I explain the law?
Yes. It was, one would say, in modern times, not a democratic law in the sense that it wasn't favorable to democracy. It really infringed upon the free speech of those who disagreed with the administration.
The Sedition Act was a law that made it possible to imprison any person that spoke or wrote treasonous comments. And I would defend that law by saying that it did not merely target the people that disagreed with my husband.
But weren't some people who were arrested because they disagreed with the administration?
Because they disagreed with him by publishing lies and bitterness. Some of the articles that were published were false as the English, I once wrote to my sister. I did not believe that, I believed that law was necessary to stop people from publishing untruths. Excuse me. To stop them from publishing untruths, not to stop them from merely expressing a difference of opinion. However, I did find it important then, and still find it important now, that once a man is president, that he should have the support of the country. For if he does not have the support of the country, there is no way that he can successfully operate or discharge his office.
So the law would not allow someone to speak something that was thought to be untrue. That, in other words, you're contending that free speech does not protect untruths?
Well, I contend that our country was so in its infancy at this time, and that we needed to protect against those who would print these untruths, yes.
Yes. How did you take the defeat? In hearing a presentation earlier by you, Ms. Adams, you did think, although you had a lot of respect for Thomas Jefferson, even though your husband was a Federalist and Mr. Jefferson was an anti-Federalist, and they certainly had some very, very major political disagreements, you still liked Mr. Jefferson, did you not?
I always personally considered him a friend. I did. How
did you and Mr. Adams take the defeat?
Well, we did not take the defeat badly. There were some other things going on in our lives at the time that made it a little easier. Our beloved son Charles had recently passed away to a long illness. Our daughter Nabby's husband, who was a good for nothing, if there ever was one, was giving her trouble. And it was time for us to go home. I had been very, very ill.
The weather in Washington, D.C. was very difficult on you.
Terrible on me. My rheumatism, the damp in that gigantic home where we had to keep 13 fires going round the clock to even try to get a measure of warmth. It was difficult on me, and I was exhausted by that time. my heart was heavy due to the circumstances of some of my children. And my husband's health had not been the best.
And if he'd been reelected, it might have been, it might have threatened your life. He'd be there 4 more years in a very serious way.
And his, I believe. He was ever a sensitive man to the wrongs that were said about him. And I believe that his constitution would not have held up for 4 more years of abuse. And so I think it was best that he lose the election. Because he was asked to run a second time, we would do our duty. We would not, say no to those who were asking him to run a second time.
Did you feel somewhat vindicated later, though, that the fact that your son, John Quincy Adams, would become president?
Well, I died.
I know you did.
Previous to that, but now looking
that
back from 2006,
coming back, I knew you had died, but the point is, now that you can come back
Yes.
and look at that, the advantage of coming back in history.
Yes, that is the advantage. I do feel vindicated. My son, John Quincy, had been raised from the cradle to take a leadership role in our new nation. I had taken him to the Hill to witness the Battle of Bunker Hill early in the American Revolution when he was but 8 years old.
So you, in your training, you suspected that he would do something great.
I did. I very strongly suspected. I even wrote to him that these are the times in which geniuses are made, and that I expected him to take full advantage of the advantages that he had been given to give back, that I had been grooming him for public policy.
So you had great impact.
Yes, I believe that a mother always has great impact if the mother has been properly educated to be able to pass that on to her children.
Erna Reinhardt.
Great. In modern time, many of our first ladies have had a special cause, either a social cause or a public policy issue that they really spend their term championing. And I'm curious, I don't know if this was something that was true in the early part of our country, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to share with us maybe a special cause that you had while you were First Lady.
Well, I don't know that that was something that we thought in terms of. Rather, we would run our households and raise our children, and that was considered to be our area of expertise. However, if it was to be said that I had a cause that I spoke out about during the time when my husband was vice president and then president, I would have to say that it would be against slavery. Early on during the days of the American Revolution, when the fighting moved from Boston down to Virginia, I was very, very concerned about whether or not our Southern colonists would take up the cause of liberty, because they obviously had no problem whatsoever enslaving their fellow human beings, whether they would be effective fighters for the colonists. Later on, I would pay to educate various serving employees of ours, and was once visited by neighbors who did not want me to send these black children to their school. And I was very disturbed, in fact, that this capital, our nation's capital, was moved to a slave area. And so this was something that I did speak out about. But it would be quite a while before it would bear any fruit.
And maybe we already touched on this a little bit, but were there any issues that you really disagreed with your husband on?
Well, the proper role of women in the public and the proper role of women's education. He did not believe, for example, that our daughters should be educated outside of the home. And we did have only one daughter that survived into adulthood, but she was never educated outside the home. And she did not have the opportunity that her brothers did to go to Harvard or, in fact, anywhere. And that disturbed me. I felt that women should be educated if that was their desire. And I always felt that I wanted to have more education than I did in my life. I also felt that it would not compromise my role or other women's roles as a mother and a wife, just to have a little bit of public voice. And he disagreed with me on that as well.
You were really a reformer of your time, although you were very limited as the role of your husband being so prominent and conspicuous. You had to be behind the scenes, but you certainly, as we look back, both on the issue of slavery and women's rights, you were really a very modern woman.
I could tell you a secret.
Yes.
My husband was not aware of this, but he wanted to keep buying land in our later years. And I realized that once he was out of public office, we would have no cash money on which to live our retirements. And so I had my uncle buy us stocks and bonds in John's name without John's knowledge, so that we would have money to live on until our deaths. And that is what we lived on throughout our life.
Did he ever find out?
I don't believe he did, no. I don't know where he thought it was coming from.
The President of the United States was not aware of this. That's a point in history that's most interesting. This is a difficult question for you because you know history up until your death. But let me try to explain it this way. There were and will be many first ladies that will follow you. And we'll move into new centuries, and as you come to visit today, we're in the year 2006. And the first lady that brought the most change probably to our country would happen in the 20th century in the election of 1932, when Franklin D. Roosevelt would be elected president, and the first lady would be Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, modern historians often say that you were the most influential and prominent first lady until Eleanor Roosevelt. I don't know, while visiting our time, where you think it's safe to come out and talk about this. You certainly in your time didn't, but would you like to address this new historical documents that exist that indicate you were very, very influential? You said already you were an outspoken person when you could be, and you would advise your husband. Do you think you really were a very powerful first lady from that perspective?
I don't know if I would say I was a powerful first lady, but if I may blow my own horn a little bit, that's all right here, I suppose. I think that I was a powerful influence on my husband.
And from time to time, he would listen to your advice.
I believe that he would. I believe that John, perhaps women would have had a better result in our new government in the 1700s if there had been more women writing to their husbands like I wrote to John. I don't know that he was as adamantly opposed to my ideas as some of the other men might have been. However, he was ever a politician, and it was important to him to have the good regard of his peers.
And that certainly would not include telling them that you were highly influential in public policy?
Perhaps not. But even Mr. Jefferson and I exchanged many letters, and I did not hesitate to give him my ideas either. In fact, he and I had a very heated exchange on the topic of the French Revolution at the end of the 1700s. And so I don't know that I really, with people with whom I felt comfortable, I did not feel the need to stay behind the scenes.
We don't have time here, but you are also well known for, as you've said earlier in the program, writing letters. But the letters between you and John Adams, your husband, were very, very powerful, and your letters were very eloquent because, as we indicated, he was gone a lot. Could you share just a little bit of how that was helpful to you, because you were alone a lot with the children, but you stayed in connection through the letters?
I did. I think that for a lot of it, I enjoyed getting his letters, but the majority of the letters were from myself to him. You may know that during this time period, if somebody is overseas, I did not always receive. I believe that the historical record, as I understand it, has a much more complete record of our correspondence than either he or I ever received during our lifetimes, because we would each keep copies of the letters we sent to each other. While he was overseas, I did not always receive his letters back. And so we would have to write each other things that we wanted each other to know that were in our heart, and did not always receive our response.
But those
right
were
then.
preserved because you had the copy, and so now they have been available.
Yes, and so they were very important, however, to me because I could work out problems that I was having with the farm in my own head, kind of onto paper, and send it to him. And even if I didn't receive a response from him giving me guidance on what I should do, it helped me to clarify my thoughts.
Ernest Reinhardt.
Well, I want to follow up on that. It amazes me that you ran the farm. Share with us what that was like.
Well, it wasn't always easy because during that time period, we didn't have a lot of income. What I was able to make off of running the farm was what our family had to live on, especially in the early days, because even when my husband was vice president, Congress had not yet voted on a salary for the vice president. And so it was what we could make from the farm. While John was overseas, he would also send me goods from France that were quite highly prized in the Americas, and I would sell them. But my uncle, Cotton Tufts, was a great assistance to me because I could negotiate in my husband's name through my uncle to buy land. Because when land adjoining our farm would come up for sale, and I could see that it would be beneficial to us to buy it, as a married woman, I could not own property of my own. And so I had to negotiate my husband's name to buy it, but I was able to add on to our holdings that way, make some actual cash money.
You were a great businesswoman,
things.
among other things.
I prided myself, and that was one of the things I took the most pride in myself throughout my lifetime, is my entrepreneurship.
On that note, ladies and gentlemen, I have to introduce the person that has portrayed so eloquently Abigail Adams. Introduce to you Julie Tiger-Liegert. She's a member of the faculty at North Idaho College, and she teaches in, guess what, the field of history, as you might expect, particularly U.S. history. Julie, thank you for doing this. And when you presented to the audience, you had the same kind of eloquence, and you're highly, highly informed. And you've played another character before on the Popcorn Forum, and we hope you will do it again in the future.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll join us again next week when we will move to program number 9 in this series of Journey Through Time, and we'll have a conversation with some famous people in history. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.